Hey everyone, and welcome. Tonight we're not just dipping our toes. We're diving headfirst into some of history's most compelling, often misunderstood, and frankly terrifying realities. We'll start with the gritty, inglorious existence of the medieval assassin, a far cry from the romanticized figures of fiction. Then we'll shift gears to the serpentine ambition of Olympias, a queen mother whose influence shaped an empire and whose wrath was legendary. From there, we'll wander the mystifying ruins of Naissus, trying to unravel the truth behind the myth of the Minotaur and the enigmatic Minoan civilization. And finally, we'll feel the thunderous impact of ancient siege engines, the colossal machines that brought down empires. So, before we truly begin this odyssey, if you appreciate these deep dives into the often overlooked corners of history, consider liking the video and subscribing. It genuinely helps. And as always, I'm curious. Where are you joining from? And what time is it in your part of the world? Drop it in the comments. It's always a thrill to see our global community. Alright, dim those lights, perhaps get that fan humming for a bit of atmospheric ambience, and let's journey together into the past. Let's be brutally honest from the outset. No one in the medieval period, amidst the squalor, the plagues, and the ever-present threat of a painful death, woke up one fine morning, stretched, and declared, "You know what? My true calling is to plunge a rusty dagger into a nobleman's gullet for a handful of silver," followed by the distinct honor of hiding in a manure cart for 3 days to escape. Becoming an assassin wasn't a career choice. It was the last, desperate stop on the life went irretrievably wrong express. Forget the silver screen portrayals of sleek, shadowy figures trained in hidden mountaintop monasteries, masters of arcane arts, and bound by ancient codes. The overwhelming majority of medieval assassins were not these enigmatic loners. They were often desperate peasants driven by starvation or revenge after a lord had seized their land. They were disgraced soldiers, men who knew how to kill but had lost their honor, their company, or their war. They were ex-thieves with a steady hand and a knack for quiet entry, or individuals so utterly marginalized, so far off society's radar. They could commit murder and still be overlooked in the next village census. If you possessed wealth, land, even a moderately healthy goat, you weren't an assassin. You were management. You hired an assassin. You were the one with clean hands and a plausible alibi. But if you'd recently, say, narrowly escaped a debtor's prison, if you had a whispered reputation for solving intractable problems, and if you could navigate the treacherous back alleys of a medieval city without alerting every stray dog and night watchman, then congratulations. Sooner or later, a shadowy figure, perhaps a nervous merchant or a minor noble with ambitions exceeding his station, would slide a meager coin purse across a grimy tavern table and whisper a name. And that name was never going to be Bob the kindly, turnip farming peasant. Your targets were the powerful, the corrupt, the well-guarded, a tyrannical baron squeezing his serfs dry, a bishop whose piety was measured in gold, not good deeds, or perhaps a rival claimant to a title, usually surrounded by a dozen loyal bodyguards, a moat, and a particularly vicious breed of guard dog. The pay, when offered, might seem tempting to a starving man, but the job itself was horrifying. Yet, by the time someone genuinely considered such an offer, they usually had precious little left to lose. No family to protect, no future to plan for, and most certainly no dental plan to speak of. And let's not forget the utter, crushing lack of job perks. There was no pension scheme for retired assassins, no glory in your deeds, certainly no weekends or holidays off. You couldn't exactly hang a shingle outside your hovel. Quiet eliminations and discreet removals by appointment only. Your entire existence revolved around staying silent, moving with unnatural speed and stealth, and never, ever, under any circumstances, revealing what you did for a living, especially not loudly, over a tankard of ale at the local inn. Oh me, I'm a traveling merchant. Yes, a purveyor of fine carpets. The stains, oh that's just dye. Yes, very potent dye. So, To reiterate, nobody dreamed of this life. They were ground down by the harsh realities of the medieval world, chewed up and spat out, often finding themselves clad in a ragged hood, clutching a rusty, unreliable dagger, and steeped in a profound sense of despair. You weren't the hero of any story. You weren't even the clear-cut villain. You were a terrifying footnote, a whisper in the dark that made everyone uneasy, and you most likely wouldn't live long enough to spend the pittance you earned. Now, let's shatter the first, and perhaps most pervasive, myth, the sophisticated training of the medieval assassin. Forget the candlelit dojos, the hidden monasteries echoing with inspirational flute music and the wise, grizzled mentors dispensing ancient secrets. There was no training montage, no sagely teacher offering pep talks and profound life lessons. If you learned anything, it was through the brutal, unforgiving school of hard knocks, specifically by not dying the first, second, or third time you attempted to kill. Most assassins were, to put it mildly, desperate amateurs. Perhaps they had a decent sense of direction, enough to find the target's residence and the ability to climb a low wall without sneezing at the critical moment. If you had prior military experience, that was a significant advantage. It meant you at least knew which end of a knife was the pointy one and how to use it with some semblance of efficiency. If not, well, the act of stabbing someone is, tragically, fairly intuitive. But escaping the scene afterwards, with all your internal organs still where they belong, and the city guard not hot on your heels, that took a combination of skill, cunning, and an enormous amount of luck. Mostly, it was luck. There were no assassins, guilds offering orientation meetings, no safety briefings, no assassin's handbook for dummies. You weren't taught how to spot a body double, the best way to pick a medieval lock, or where nobles typically kept their emergency exits if such things even existed. You figured it out, usually while dangling precariously from a window ledge, covered in mud, wondering if you'd accidentally crept into the scullery maid's quarters again, instead of the baron's bedchamber, and poison. That was a terrifying game of trial and error, with a heavy, often fatal, emphasis on the error. Sometimes it worked spectacularly. Sometimes your target merely experienced a bout of mild dizziness, became significantly more suspicious of his soup, and doubled his food tasters. And sometimes, in a moment of tragic irony, you drank from the wrong cup or mishandled the substance. There was no medieval poison control hotline to call, no antidote readily available, just desperate hope, unreliable herbal guesswork, and the need for an exceptionally strong stomach. Sure, if you were exceptionally lucky, lottery winning, finding a diamond dino dunghill lucky, you might have picked up a few useful skills. From associating with seasoned thieves or hardened mercenaries, perhaps an older, cynical assassin, moments before expiring from a poorly treated wound, might have grudgingly shown you how to walk silently on cobblestones, or the best way to use shadows to your advantage. But formal mentoring wasn't standard practice. It was a rare, short-lived luxury, primarily because successful assassins don't retire to teach. They simply disappear, one way or another. Weapons training. Forget it. You weren't a knight carrying a gleaming broadsword or a bat. Your arsenal consisted of a dagger, probably stolen from a sleeping guard or looted from a corpse. Maybe a garrote fashioned from a piece of wire if you were feeling particularly ambitious. And whatever else you could conceal under your ragged cloak without it jingling like a jester's bells. So, no, you weren't some shadowy martial arts master gliding through moonlit courtyards. You were more likely a gaunt individual with calloused hands, unnervingly quiet footsteps, and a deeply unhealthy, parasitic relationship with the darkest, foulest alleyways. Success, when it came, wasn't a product of meticulous training. It was born from raw, desperate survival instincts. You learned how to kill by doing it quickly, often sloppily, and then vanishing like smoke before anyone could get a good look at your face and commission a wanted poster to be tacked to every church door and market cross in the Shire. In short, your education was brutal, intensely practical, and offered zero graduation ceremonies. Just a growing collection of bruises, bloodstains, and the creeping, soul-crushing realization that you were utterly, terrifyingly on your own. Let's talk about the primary motivator, the glittering lure that dragged people into this wretched profession. Coin. Cold, hard, reassuringly heavy, deliciously spendable coin. The promise of it was the hook, but the reality, you often got paid in lies, betrayal, and a swift knife in the back if you weren't careful. When someone hires an assassin, they're not looking for a long-term working relationship, complete with benefits and a Christmas bonus. They want a undeniable service. No paperwork, no receipts, and ideally, no surviving witnesses, and that often included you. They might offer you a pouch of silver, perhaps half up front if they were feeling generous or particularly desperate, and the other half when the job is done. But here's the kicker. When the job is done was often medieval code for after we've verified you haven't monumentally messed it up, made us look like incompetent fools, left a trail of evidence leading directly back to our doorstep, or, most importantly, survived long enough to tell anyone about our little arrangement. So, you do the deed. You slink through darkened corridors, risk life and limb, maybe successfully dispatch a corrupt official in his sleep. It's not pretty, it's not poetic, it's brutal and terrifying. And when you return, bruised and bloodied, to claim your due. Ah, yes, about that remaining payment. Your erstwhile client might say, looking shifty, terribly sorry, but the funds have unexpectedly dried up. Or worse, they decide that a well-aimed knife to your gut is a far cheaper and more permanent solution than paying you a bonus. Dead assassins tell no tales and demand no further compensation. Even when you did get paid, it was seldom enough. Not for the mortal risk you undertook, not for the blood on your hands and soul, not for the 3 agonizing days you spent hiding in a flea-infested haystack, subsisting on stale bread and wrestling with a potent cocktail of terror and moral regret. You'd receive a handful of coins, a curt, dismissive nod, and an implicit, chilling reminder. You were never here. We never met. This conversation never happened. And here's a fun fact for aspiring medieval assassins. Some contracts were entirely bogus. Elaborate political traps. You'd be hired to assassinate someone supposedly dangerous, only to discover your target was a decoy, and the chamber was filled with guards specifically waiting to apprehend you. Congratulations, you've just walked into a meticulously planned sting operation, and your name is already being carved onto a spot on the gallows. And even if the deal was genuine and the client simply reneged on payment, what recourse did you have? You couldn't exactly file a grievance with the local magistrate. Your Honor, I'd like to formally sue Lord Beaumont for egregious breach of assassin contract. Clause 3, subsection B, pertaining to timely remittance of funds upon completion of services rendered. The only court you were likely to see was the one where you were Exhibit A, shortly before being sentenced to a very public and painful execution. So, you learned, if you survived long enough, to demand as much payment upfront as possible. To trust absolutely no one, not the trembling intermediary who swore this job would set you up for life, not the nervous noble who promised you protection. It did change your life, usually by drastically shortening it. Being an assassin meant living a precarious existence fueled by broken promises and the constant need to vanish before those promises, or your employers broke you. All right, you've reluctantly taken the job. You've been thoroughly lied to about the lucrative pay. You're acutely aware that your chances of survival are slim. Now, let's talk about your toolkit. Forget the romanticized arsenals from fantasy novels and stealth action video games. There were no magically enchanted daggers that returned to your hand. No smoke bombs for dramatic escapes. no retractable wrist blades for silent takedowns, and certainly no crossbows that conveniently folded down to fit inside your boot. Your equipment consisted of whatever wretched items you could steal, sharpen on a whetstone, or conceal beneath a tattered, lice-ridden cloak without clanking like a one-man band. If you were exceptionally lucky, and I mean stumble upon a lost Roman treasure hoard lucky, you might possess a decent dagger, not an ornate jewel-encrusted ceremonial piece, not a wickedly curved blade like a dragon's tooth, just a simple, brutally effective piece of sharp steel. Hopefully it was relatively rust-free, and ideally, one that didn't still carry the lingering scent of the last unfortunate soul you'd used it on poison. As we've touched upon, certainly existed. But it wasn't the glamorous, sophisticated tool of intrigue often portrayed. There was no subtle, slow-acting toxin dripped into a wine goblet that would ensure a peaceful, untraceable demise. Most medieval poisons were dangerously unpredictable, concocted from readily available but highly variable plants like nightshade or hemlock, noxious minerals, or even the desiccated glands of toads. Some might work with terrifying speed. Others might take agonizing hours, or even days, to take effect. And some, infuriatingly, would merely cause your target to vomit violently for 2 days, recover fully, and emerge angrier, more paranoid, and now intensely suspicious of any stew placed before him. Getting the dosage right was a terrifying gamble. Ropes, occasionally useful. You could use one for strangulation, for a desperate climb, or to tie something or someone up. But you'd better be proficient in its use, and quick about it, because nothing kills the clandestine mood of an assassination attempt like fumbling with a knot while your target is waking up and screaming for the guards, muttering, "Wait, is it over, under, then through the loop," or bows and crossbows. Effective, certainly, if you possessed one, knew how to shoot it accurately under pressure, and weren't attempting to smuggle it through a heavily guarded palace disguised as a humble flower arranger. Most assassinations, by necessity, were up-close, brutally personal affairs. There was rarely time or opportunity for elegant marksmanship from a distance. It was about being quick, quiet, and hopefully not messy enough to cause you to slip in the ensuing chaos, and you certainly didn't have backup weapons or spare parts. If your one trusty blade bent, snapped, or clattered down a well during a critical moment, it was time to improvise, and fast. A heavy slate roof tile, perhaps. A rusty nail found in the gutter, worth a shot if you were desperate enough. Your shoe buckle, wielded with murderous intent. Desperate times call for desperate, and often pathetic, measures. You carried your meager tools hidden in the hems of your garments, tucked into worn-out boots, or, if you were particularly ingenious, concealed inside a hollowed-out loaf of bread. And you kept them close, not for a sense of security, but because in this grim line of work, your weapon was your only reliable friend, your demanding boss, and, in a bleak sort of way, your only retirement plan, usually one that involved you dying with it in your hand. There were no upgrades, no opportunities to tinker with your gear between missions in a hidden workshop. You didn't lovingly polish your kit. You prayed fervently that it wouldn't betray you mid-strike, that the blade wouldn't dull, or the poison wouldn't affect you, because in the end, it wasn't the sophistication of the weapon that did the killing. It was you alone, poorly equipped, probably starving, and expected to perform miracles of silent death with little more than a sharpened spoon and a desperate prayer. Now, let us journey from the grimy alleys of the assassin to the perfumed poisoned courts of ancient Macedon, and meet a woman whose ambition was as vast as her son's empire, and whose methods were as deadly as any assassin's blade. Olympias, before she was the feared queen mother of Macedon, the mother of Alexander the Great, she was Myrtle, a princess hailing from the rugged tribal lands of Epirus in northwestern Greece. Her people, the Molossians, were a proud, somewhat wild folk, claiming direct descent from the legendary hero Achilles himself. And whether or not the actual blood of demigods coursed through her veins, one thing became terrifyingly clear: Myrtle was not a woman destined for the quiet, embroidered tapestries of history's sidelines. From her earliest years, Myrtle was steeped in an atmosphere of mysticism and ancient ritual. Her upbringing in the Epirode court was shaped not merely by the pragmatic concerns of dynastic politics, but by prophecy, ecstatic religious rites, and a profound, personal reverence for the Thanic, ancient gods. She was not the sort of princess who contented herself with demure smiles and courtly dances. No, Myrtle was drawn to the primeval, to serpents, to omens, and to the frenzied, torchlit ceremonies of the cult of Dionysus, where women, the Maenads, danced barefoot under the moon, their hair unbound, calling upon the divine in states of ecstatic trance, sometimes tearing wild animals apart with their bare hands. Her connection to these gods, particularly Dionysus and perhaps snake deities, wasn't performative. It was deeply, viscerally personal. She didn't merely worship. She embodied the divine presence. Ancient sources, often penned by men who were simultaneously terrified and enthralled by her, whispered that she kept sacred, non-venomous snakes, symbols of wisdom, rebirth, and the underworld, in her private chambers, and even allowed them to coil beside her in her bed. Whether this was a literal daily fact, or the kind of salacious slander that powerful, unconventional women invariably attract like flies to honey, we will never truly know. But the image stuck to her allies. It amplified her aura of divine favor. To her enemies, it marked her as dangerously otherworldly, a sorceress. Her true power, therefore, began not on a battlefield or in a gilded throne room, but in the uneasy, flickering light of torches, amidst the hushed whispers of priestesses, the scent of burning incense, and the sinuous curling bodies of serpents. She was more than just a princess. She was perceived by many as a living oracle, a woman touched by something far older than mundane politics, and colder, more relentless than tempered steel. So, when Philip II of Macedon, a man as brutal and ambitious as he was brilliant and famously libidinous, arrived on the sacred island of Samothrace for a religious initiation into the mystery cults there, he didn't just encounter a striking. Their marriage, around 357 BCE, was far more than a mere political alliance between Macedon and Epirus. It was a collision of raw ambition, prophetic destiny, and untamed power. And from the very outset, it was shrouded in omens and portents. Some whispered that lightning, the symbol of Zeus, struck the sky on their wedding night. Others, including Olympias herself, later claimed she dreamed of a thunderbolt entering her womb, a divine impregnation. All of it would coalesce into the legend of her son. But one thing is absolutely certain. The union of Myrtle, now Olympias, and Philip II didn't just create a child. It created Alexander the Great. And Olympias, from his very first breath, intended to shape his destiny, and through him, the world. Olympias's marriage to Philip II was no storybook romance, no gentle merging of kingdoms. From its inception, it was a combustible, volatile mix of prophecy, fierce pride, and knowing paranoia. Philip, a ruthless expansionist and a charismatic leader, was already a seasoned polygamist, collecting wives like military trophies, each marriage a strategic move to secure an alliance, pacify a conquered territory, or produce more heirs. Olympias, likely still in her late teens when she married him, was his fourth or fifth wife, but she was anything but naive. She recognized in Philip a man whose monumental ambition mirrored her own. And perhaps, in her deeply spiritual worldview, she saw him as a divinely ordained match for her own prophetic destiny. Macedon itself wasn't an easy kingdom for an outsider, especially one as fiercely independent as Olympias, to navigate. It was a harsh martial land, a kingdom forged in iron and ambition. where kings were frequently assassinated by their own kin, where brothers turned into deadly rivals overnight, and where loyalty was a fluid, often treacherous commodity. Yet, Olympias, the fiery priestess from Epirus, walked into this viper's nest with her head held high, her eyes already fixed on the ultimate prize, ensuring her offspring would wear the crown. Their marriage, predictably, was rocky from the start. Philip, for all his political acumen and military genius, was not, by any stretch of the imagination, built for monogamy. He continued to marry other women, often for strategic alliances, always to consolidate his power. But Olympias was not one to sit quietly in the shadows, embroidering and awaiting her husband's infrequent visits. She held her own court, maintained her own network of loyal Epirot followers and Macedonian sympathizers, and was known to frequently consult oracles and engage in her accustomed religious rites to divine the future and perhaps to influence Philip's fate. Then came the birth of their son, Alexander, in 356 BCE. Even this event was wrapped in layers of celestial drama and divine portent, much of it likely cultivated by Olympias herself. Legends, perhaps originating with her, claimed she dreamed that a thunderbolt from Zeus struck her womb, igniting a great fire that spread far and wide before being extinguished. Philip too reportedly had a prophetic dream after their consummation, that he sealed his wife's womb with a seal bearing the image of a lion. A literal lion. Whether they genuinely believed these divine omens or cleverly manufactured them to bolster their son's future claim, they certainly acted as if Alexander was destined not merely to rule a kingdom, but to conquer the world. But even as the royal child was celebrated, the cracks in the royal marriage deepened into chasms. Olympias, proud and possessive, deeply resented Philip's other wives, particularly his later Macedonian bride, Cleopatra Eurydice, whom he married around 337 BCE. This wasn't just a matter of domestic jealousy, it was a direct and dangerous political threat. Cleopatra Eurydice was a Macedonian noblewoman, and any son she bore Philip would be considered purer in blood by the traditional Macedonian aristocracy, a more legitimately Macedonian heir than Alexander, whose mother was This posed an immediate and severe threat to Alexander's future succession. Olympias saw the danger with chilling clarity. The palace at Pella was not just a home, it was a battlefield of subtle poisons, whispered accusations, and deadly intrigues, and she was prepared to use every weapon at her disposal. Every snake, every dream, every ritual, every carefully planted rumor, to ensure that her son, Alexander, wasn't just remembered, but crowned. She was no longer just Myrtle, the Epirot princess. She was Olympias, mother of a divinely touched heir, and no one, absolutely no one, would take her son's throne without first facing her formidable, serpentine wrath. By the time Alexander had grown into a fiercely intelligent and ambitious teenager, tutored by no less than Aristotle himself, the Macedonian palace in Pella had devolved into a veritable war zone of veiled insults, intricate political maneuvering, and bitter, simmering rivalries. Olympias wasn't merely fighting for her own influence. She was engaged in a desperate, high-stakes battle for her son's survival and his birthright. She knew the court was filled with snakes, but she, the serpent-handling priestess, was the one who had taught many of them how to bite. Philip II, increasingly preoccupied with his expanding empire and military campaigns, had begun to noticeably distance himself from her. He was campaigning more frequently, drinking more heavily, and, perhaps most alarmingly for Olympias, listening more intently to his purely Macedonian advisors, many of whom viewed the Epirot queen with suspicion and hostility. The final irrevocable blow to their fractured relationship came when Philip, in his late 40s, married the young Macedonian noblewoman Cleopatra Eurydice. This wasn't just another political marriage. Cleopatra was the niece of Attalus, one of Philip's most powerful and trusted generals. To Olympias, this was not merely a personal betrayal. It was an overt declaration of war on her and Alexander's legitimacy. The wedding feast was a public disaster, a catastrophe that laid bare the seething tensions within the royal family. Attalus, drunk and emboldened, publicly toasted the marriage, praying that Philip and Cleopatra Eurydice would produce a legitimate Macedonian heir. This was a direct, unambiguous insult to Olympias and a challenge to Alexander's lineage. Was he truly Philip's son? Or, as Olympias sometimes hinted, was he the son of a god, perhaps Zeus himself? Attalus meant it as a slur, questioning Alexander's parentage and right to rule. But Olympias, ever adept at turning adversity to her advantage, likely seized upon this myth. Let them whisper, let them believe her son was touched by divinity. It only made him seem more destined, more untouchable. An enraged Alexander, according to Plutarch, hurled his cup at Attalus and demanded to know if he thought him a bastard. Philip, equally enraged, drew his sword and lunged at his son, but, being drunk and unsteady, he tripped and fell. Alexander, contemptuously, is said to have quipped, "See there, men. He who was preparing to cross from Europe to Asia cannot even cross from one couch to another." The fallout was immediate and severe. Alexander stormed out of the feast and, shortly thereafter, went into voluntary exile in Illyria, taking Olympias with him back to her native Epirus. But her exile was not a sign of defeat. It was a strategic retreat. In her homeland, she was still royalty, a powerful figure in her own right. She could gather support among the Epirus, whisper in the ears of sympathetic Greek city-states, and watch, with cold calculation, as Philip's increasingly fractured court began to rot from within due to his own high-handedness and the machinations of his new wife's ambitious family. Olympias didn't need to be physically present in Pella to be a dangerous and destabilizing force. Then, in 336 BCE, came the shockwave that reverberated throughout the Greek world. Philip II was assassinated, stabbed to death by Pausanias of Orestes, a member of his own royal bodyguard, during the lavish wedding celebration of his daughter, Cleopatra of Macedon, Alexander's sister, to Alexander I of Epirus, Olympias's brother. Philip was at the height of his power, on the very eve of launching his grand invasion of the Persian Empire, a campaign that he hoped would crown him not just king of Macedon, but potentially the master of the known world. The question that echoed through every marble corridor and torchlit hall of Aija, the ancient Macedonian capital where the wedding took place, was the same. Who was truly behind it? Was it merely Pausanias, the jilted former lover of Philip, seeking personal revenge for a grievance? Was it the result of complex court intrigue among disgruntled Macedonian nobles? Was it Alexander himself, impatient for the throne and resentful of his father's recent actions? Or, whispered ever so softly, was it Olympias, the spurned queen, orchestrating events from her exile in Epirus, using her network of contacts and her brother, the king of Epirus, to exact her revenge and secure her son's accession? No one could prove her direct involvement. No one, perhaps, dared to try too hard, but many believed it. After all, within days of Alexander's swift proclamation as king, Cleopatra Eurydice and her infant child, a potential rival to Alexander, were dead. Murdered, some ancient sources claim, by Olympias herself, or at her direct instigation, in a manner both brutal and symbolic. The serpent had returned to the palace, coiled and venomous, and now, with Philip gone and his potential rivals eliminated, nothing stood between her son, Alexander, and the throne of Macedon, and with it, the world. From the blood-soaked intrigues of the Macedonian court, let us now journey further back in time, and south to the sun-drenched island of Crete. Here, just a few miles from the modern city of Heraklion, lie the sprawling, enigmatic ruins of a place that feels more like a dream, or perhaps a half-forgotten nightmare, than a tangible piece of history. Naissus. Stone corridors snake in seemingly random directions, rooms twist and double back upon themselves, grand staircases appear to lead nowhere, and courtyards open unexpectedly to the sky. Even today, with maps and guides, it's astonishingly easy to lose your sense of direction, to feel a disorienting sense of being delightfully, or perhaps unnervingly lost. This is Nasus, the pulsating heart of the mysterious Minoan civilization, and the supposed almost universally accepted inspiration for one of the most potent and enduring myths in all of human history, the Labyrinth of the Minotaur. But long before the legend took root, there was a palace utterly unlike any other in the ancient world. Initially built around 1900 BCE, and then expanded, rebuilt, and modified over many centuries, Nasus wasn't merely a royal residence for a king or queen. It was an entire, sprawling city contained under one vast, complex roof, covering an area of nearly 150,000 square feet. That's over 3 acres. It featured an estimated 1,000 interconnected rooms, innovative light wells that channeled sunlight deep into the structure's core, vast storage magazines filled with giant pithoi jars for olive oil and wine, sacred shrines adorned with enigmatic symbols, bustling workshops for artisans, and, remarkably, what may well have been the first sophisticated flushing toilet systems in history, complete with terracotta pipes for running water and drainage. It boasted multi-story apartment blocks, grand halls, and an intricate, almost organic system of air circulation. This was no primitive mud brick fortress. This was an architectural masterpiece, a testament to a civilization of extraordinary ingenuity and artistic sensibility. To modern archaeologists, Nasus can appear as a marvel of organized chaos, a beautifully bewildering puzzle. To ancient visitors, particularly those from less sophisticated mainland cultures, it must have felt like stepping into a realm of magic, or perhaps a carefully constructed trap. The man who, more than any other, brought Nasus out of the dust of millennia and into modern awareness was the British archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans. Beginning his excavations in the early 1900s, Evans quickly became utterly convinced that this sprawling, disorienting complex was the very origin of the Greek labyrinth myth. The very layout seemed designed to confuse and mislead. The architecture was rich in symbolism that hinted at complex rituals, and everywhere he turned, he found striking motifs of bulls. Bulls painted in vibrant frescoes on the walls, bulls carved into stone reliefs, bulls sculpted into tiny, exquisite golden charms. The bull, after all, was clearly a sacred and central animal to the Minoans. Evans even went so far as to name the entire civilization he was uncovering Minoan, after the legendary King Minos of Crete, the mythical commissioner of the labyrinth. Whether King Minos was a real historical figure, a composite of several rulers, or purely a product of later Greek storytelling, his legend became inextricably, permanently, intertwined with these majestic ruins. But here lies the fascinating twist, the enduring enigma. Despite decades of meticulous excavation, no one has ever found a literal, subterranean, maze-like labyrinth at Nasus. There are no hidden prison chambers designed to hold a monstrous beast, no definitive archaeological evidence of a half-man, half-bull creature. What we have instead is something far more subtle, far more mysterious, and perhaps far more profound. A palace city designed in intricate loops, interconnected wings, and multiple confusing layers. A place deliberately, or perhaps intuitively, difficult to navigate. And the deeper one delves into its remains, and into the stories it inspired, the more the lines between tangible history and evocative mythology begin to blur, to shimmer, to coalesce. So the question that still hangs heavy in the Cretan air remains: was the terrifying legend of the Minotaur born from within these ancient, sophisticated walls a folk memory of something real or symbolic? Or was the palace itself, in its bewildering, awe-inspiring complexity, the true monster, the architectural embodiment of a power that both fascinated and frightened its neighbors. Gnosis may not give up its deepest secrets easily, but it is exceptionally good at making us ask the most compelling, and perhaps unanswerable, questions about the dawn of European civilization. The myth itself is as famous and chilling as the ruin it's associated with, a monstrous creature, the Minotaur, with the body of a powerful man and the head and tail of a ferocious bull, trapped deep within an inescapable labyrinth. This labyrinth was said to be so cunningly designed by the master craftsman Daedalus that no one who ventured inside ever found their way out, doomed to wander its bewildering passages until they were devoured by the beast. Only Theseus, the heroic prince of Athens, aided by a crucial ball of thread given to him by the compassionate Cretan princess Ariadne, daughter of King Minos, managed to slay the Minotaur and navigate his way back out of the deadly maze. But where did this potent, terrifying story truly originate? And why a labyrinth? Why a bullman? The earliest versions of the myth, found in later Greek writings, speak of King Minos, the immensely powerful and often tyrannical ruler of Crete, as punishment for an ancient Athenian transgression, often the murder of his son Androgeus. Minos demanded a gruesome tribute from Athens. Every year, or perhaps every 9 years, 7 young Athenian boys and 7 young Athenian girls were to be sent to Crete. These unfortunate youths were then sacrificed, fed to the Minotaur, a creature said to have been born from divine punishment and royal shame, the offspring of Minos's wife, Pasiphae, and a magnificent white bull sent by the sea god Poseidon, with whom Pasiphae had conceived an unnatural passion. The Minotaur, locked away in its subterranean maze, came to symbolize the dark, savage underbelly of unchecked power, something primal and terrifying hidden beneath a veneer of sophisticated grandeur. To the ancient Greeks of the mainland, particularly during the archaic and classical periods, Crete had long been perceived as a land of immense wealth, profound mystery, and a certain residual fear. Its seafaring people, the Minoans, a term, remember, coined by Evans, were seen as both incredibly elegant and somewhat alien, their customs and beliefs distinct from those of the Hellenes. Their rituals, as depicted in their art, involved dangerous-looking bull leaping. Their artwork portrayed strange, often female-centric deities, and their palaces, like Knossos, were unlike anything found on the Greek mainland, vast, sprawling, unfortified, and labyrinthine. To a visiting Greek from, say, 1000 BCE, looking at the already ancient ruins or hearing tales passed down, Knossos might well have felt like stepping into another world, a place of ancient, perhaps dangerous, magic. The bull itself, as Evans correctly deduced, was undeniably sacred in Minoan culture. Vivid frescoes like the famous Toreador fresco from Knossos show young men and women, with astonishing agility and grace, vaulting over the backs of charging bulls in what appears to be a ritualistic display of courage and skill. Horns of consecration, stylized representations of bull horns, appear frequently on rooftops, altars, and in sacred imagery throughout Minoan sites. Combine this pervasive bull cult with a palace complex that genuinely feels like a bewildering maze, and the core ingredients for a powerful, enduring legend begin to stir and take shape. But what if the Minotaur wasn't just a literal monster? What if it was a potent metaphor? Some scholars believe the tale of Athenian tribute reflects a distant, distorted folk memory of Cretan maritime dominance over the Aegean world during the Bronze Age, a time when Athens, then a much smaller and weaker power, may have indeed paid some form of tribute, economic or political, to a stronger, stranger, and perhaps more intimidating Cretan civilization. The labyrinth, in this interpretation, could symbolize the complex political and economic entrapment of weaker states within the Minoan sphere of influence, and the Minotaur itself. Perhaps it represented the raw, terrifying, and seemingly untamable force behind Minoan rule, a power that demanded respect, and perhaps sacrifice. Others argue for a more psychological or archetypal interpretation, The labyrinth as a symbol of the unconscious mind, its winding passages representing the complexities of the human psyche. The Minotaur then becomes the embodiment of our hidden primal urges, our inner beast. And Theseus, the hero, represents the conscious self, bravely venturing into the darkness of the unknown. Guided only by the thread of intuition, or memory, Ariadne's thread, to confront and integrate that shadow self. Still, the myth remains inextricably, almost physically, tangled with the stones of Knossos. The palace is the closest thing we have ever found to a real, tangible labyrinth. No literal monster has been unearthed, no skeletal remains of Athenian youths, no Ariadne patiently waiting with her ball of thread. But perhaps what Knossos offers is something deeper, more resonant. Not just a myth echoing faintly through the corridors of history, but a history, a place, an entire civilization that was, in its very essence, asking to become myth, destined to be remembered more for the stories. From the silent mysteries of Knossos, we now catapult ourselves forward in time, into the deafening, terrifying, and brutally ingenious world of ancient siege warfare. When diplomacy failed and armies met not in open fields, but at the unyielding stone faces of fortified cities, a different kind of conflict began, a slow grinding, and often horrific battle of engineering, attrition, and psychological terror. And at the heart of this were the siege engines, colossal machines designed to tear down the very symbols of power and safety. Let's start with the most primal, the most straightforward, and perhaps the most viscerally satisfying of siege engines. The battering ram. Its concept is as old as warfare itself. If a door is locked, or a wall is in your way, hit it. Hit it hard. Hit it repeatedly. Ancient engineers, however, knew they were doing far more than just knocking. They were applying focused, relentless force to overcome static resistance. The earliest rams were brutally simple, often little more than large. Sturdy tree trunks, perhaps with one end crudely sharpened or capped with metal. Teams of soldiers, their muscles straining, their faces grim, would simply lift this massive log and, with a synchronized guttural roar, smash it against enemy gates or weaker sections of a wall. Like a band of frenzied armored lumberjacks. It was exhausting, dangerous work, exposing the crew to missiles and boiling liquids from above. But over time, driven by necessity and ingenuity, the battering ram evolved into a far more sophisticated and terrifying weapon. Engineers realized that by suspending the ram from a wheeled timber frame, often covered with a protective roof of dampened animal hides to ward off fire arrows and flaming pitch, they transformed it from a simple, handheld tool into a veritable weapon of terror. This not only protected the crew, but also allowed for a much heavier beam to be used, swung with greater momentum and precision. Much like a giant pendulum of destruction, the Assyrians, those undisputed masters of early siege warfare in the Near East circa 9th-7th centuries BCE, elevated the battering ram to an art form and a psychological weapon. Their intricate relief carvings from palaces like Nineveh depict fearsome, multi-storied siege towers that often incorporated powerful, iron-tipped battering rams at their base. These machines, sometimes adorned with menacing animal heads, would roll slowly, inexorably, up to the gates of rebellious cities, like slow-moving gods of destruction, while archers positioned on the upper levels of the tower rained down arrows. Upon the defenders, the message was clear. Resistance was futile, and it wasn't just the main gates they were smashing. Rams were strategically employed to breach weaker points in curtain walls, to batter down vulnerable watchtowers, or to collapse entire gatehouse structures. The sheer rhythmic thudding impact of a large ram against stone or timber was a sound designed to shatter not just defenses, but also morale. Its presence outside your walls meant one of two things: a swift surrender, or the agonizing certainty of watching your city's defenses crumble like stale bread. Piece by piece, the Greeks, particularly during the Hellenistic period, refined the design further, creating larger and more specialized rams. But it was the Romans, those unparalleled engineers of the ancient world, who arguably perfected them. Roman military engineers constructed massive rams, which they called Ares, Latin for ram, as in the male sheep, suspended by heavy chains or ropes within enormous mobile siege shelters, known as testudos tortoises or vigna trellised walkways. Some of these Roman rams were so colossal, reportedly over 100 feet long, that they required dozens, sometimes even hundreds, of men to operate in shifts. The deafening, rhythmic boom of their swinging beam against a city wall was said to sound like thunder rolling across stone, a relentless drumbeat counting down to the city's demise. And yet, for all their imposing brute force, operating a battering ram successfully required incredible teamwork, discipline, and courage. The operators, often working in cramped, stifling conditions, had to maintain the ram's powerful, rhythmic swing, often for hours on end, while simultaneously defending their vulnerable machine from burning missiles, massive stones, and all manner of foul, often boiling, substances hurled down upon them by desperate defenders. A stalled or burning ram was a useless dead ram, a monument to failed aggression. Still, when a well-constructed, well-manned battering ram got into its rhythm, got truly going, it was a terrifyingly unstoppable force. It was ancient physics, weaponized with brutal efficiency, wooden muscle amplified by mechanics, pitted against human masonry, and it was only the beginning of how ancient engineers would learn to make even the strongest walls weep if the battering ram was the brute force, the heavy infantry of siege weaponry. Then the catapult was the tactician, the ranged artillery, where rams delivered their devastating blows up close and personal. Catapults attacked from a safer distance, launching not just heavy stones, but also a profound sense of psychological dread into the heart of a besieged city. They were the first truly effective artillery pieces in military history, and they revolutionized siege warfare by weaponizing the principles of physics, tension, torsion, and leverage in ways that must have felt almost magical or demonic to those on the receiving end. The earliest forms of catapults emerged from the intellectually fertile Greek world around the 4th century BCE. They were a direct product of brilliant minds, engineers, mathematicians, and inventors who sought to add significant range, power, and momentum to traditional missile weapons. Dionysius, the Elder, the ambitious tyrant of Syracuse in Sicily, is often credited with commissioning the first torsion-powered catapults. These were not simple, oversized slingshots for giants. They were sophisticated, precision-engineered instruments of siege terror, capable of hurling projectiles with unprecedented force and accuracy. The true genius of these early catapults lay in their innovative mechanics. Engineers discovered that by tightly twisting bundles of resilient, organic material, usually animal sinew, tendons, and ligaments, or in some cases, human or horsehair, they could store an enormous amount of potential energy. When this stored energy was suddenly released, it could propel a launching arm forward with incredible speed and force, hurling heavy stones, massive javelins, or even pots filled with flaming incendiaries, hundreds of meters. Two main types of torsion catapults quickly evolved and became standard. The ballista. This was essentially a giant, two-armed crossbow, powered by two independent sets of twisted sinew bundles. It was designed to launch massive, iron-tipped bolts or javelins with a relatively flat trajectory, making it ideal for targeting enemy personnel on the walls, smashing through wooden hoardings, or even attempting to snipe enemy artillery pieces. The onager, or stone thrower, mangonel. This was a single-arm torsion catapult, often with a cup or sling at the end of the throwing arm. It used one large bundle of twisted sinew to power its motion. The onager was designed to lob heavy boulders, sometimes weighing 60 pounds or more, in a high arcing trajectory, perfect for smashing down battlements, punching holes in weaker sections of walls, or simply terrorizing the inhabitants within a city. Then came the Roman engineers, who, with their characteristic pragmatism and organizational skill, never met a Greek invention they couldn't improve upon, standardize, or deploy more effectively. They built catapults that were robust, reliable, and crucially, relatively portable. These machines could be broken down into manageable components, packed onto carts, transported with the legions, and then reassembled relatively quickly on site. This gave Roman armies a formidable mobile siege train that could be brought to bear against any recalcitrant city. Some of the larger Roman catapults were capable of firing 60-pound stones at astonishing velocities, powerful enough to tear through wooden gates, shatter stone battlements, and, on occasion, obliterate any unlucky soldier who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, vividly describes the terrifying impact of Roman stone throwers during the siege of Jerusalem, noting how a single stone could decapitate a man or shatter a pregnant woman. Asterisk catapults weren't just about physical destruction. They were instruments of spectacle and psychological warfare. Ancient generals, with a grim sense of theatricality, used them to send chilling messages. The corpses of captured spies or unfortunate messengers were sometimes launched over the city walls to spread disease, despair, and fear. Severed heads of enemy combatants, or even former allies, were lobbed into besieged cities to shatter morale and demonstrate the futility of resistance. In one particularly chilling, though debated instance, it's recorded that diseased animal carcasses, or even human bodies infected with plague, were fired into enemy territory as an early, horrifying form of biological warfare. However, catapults were not without their flaws. They were heavy, complex machines that required skilled, experienced crews to operate and maintain. Their sinew bundles were susceptible to moisture and temperature changes, which could affect their power and accuracy. They could also be rendered useless by difficult terrain or a lack of suitable ammunition. Still, when set up properly by a competent crew, a battery of catapults could systematically batter a city into submission from a relatively safe distance. And for the first time in history, the defenders of fortified cities realized that their thick stone walls didn't just need to withstand the direct, brutal assault of a battering ram at the gates. They now had to survive a relentless, terrifying bombardment from the skies. Destruction, it turned out, could fly. If the catapult was clever and efficient, the trebuchet was majestic, awe-inspiring, and utterly terrifying, towering over the medieval battlefield like a wooden colossus, creaking and groaning under immense strain. It was the undisputed king of siege warfare from the 12th century onwards. When a trebuchet, particularly a large counterweight trebuchet, appeared outside a castle or city wall, it wasn't just another weapon. It was a profound statement. It was a declaration that said, with chilling finality, your strongest walls, your highest towers, they mean nothing to me, unlike its torsion-powered cousins, the catapult and ballista, which relied on twisted sinew. The true trebuchet, the counterweight trebuchet, harnessed the simple, relentless power of gravity. At its core was an elegant, yet devastatingly effective principle. A long, sturdy swinging arm, pivoted like a giant seesaw on a robust timber frame. One end of the arm, the shorter end, held an immensely heavy counterweight, often a massive box filled with tons of earth, stone, or lead. The other, longer end of the arm terminated in a sling, which held the projectile to operate it. The long arm was winched down, raising the massive counterweight high into the air. A projectile was loaded into the sling. Then, with a sudden release, the counterweight would plummet downwards, causing the long arm to whip upwards and forwards with incredible speed and force. This motion would fling the sling and its deadly payload in a high, graceful arc over enemy defenses, releasing the projectile at the optimal point to send it crashing down onto its target. It was controlled, calculated destruction, capable of being surprisingly precise for its size, predictable in its trajectory, and utterly devastating in its impact. The ultimate origin of the trebuchet can be traced back to early traction trebuchets, which used human muscle power, teams of men pulling on ropes instead of a counterweight. These simpler machines were used by the Chinese as early as the 4th century BCE, and later spread across Asia and into the Byzantine and Islamic worlds. However, it was the development of the counterweight trebuchet, likely emerging in the Byzantine Empire or the Islamic world around the 11th or 12th century, that truly revolutionized siege warfare in Europe and the Middle East. Once European engineers got their hands on this powerful design, particularly during the era of the Crusades, it spread like wildfire, becoming a staple of every major siege. The sheer power of these machines was astonishing. A well-constructed large trebuchet, sometimes requiring weeks to assemble on site, could launch projectiles weighing 300 pounds or more over distances exceeding 300 meters. Imagine stones the size of small pieces of furniture, or even dead horses, arcing through the sky and crashing down with enough force to pulverize stone towers, shatter thick curtain walls, or leave massive craters in castle courtyards, sending defenders scrambling for cover. But the real strategic magic of the trebuchet lay in its high trajectory. Unlike catapults, which often had a flatter arc, trebuchets could hurl their projectiles over high walls with remarkable finesse. This meant they weren't just smashing the outer defenses. They were capable of targeting structures deep inside the fortifications, hitting vulnerable courtyards, collapsing barracks, destroying vital supply depots, poisoning wells, or even targeting the keep itself. And it wasn't just stones they hurled. Trebuchet crews became grimly inventive with their ammunition. Diseased animal carcasses, pigs, cattle, even horses were launched to spread sickness and despair. Barrels of burning pitch or Greek fire, if available, were sent sailing over the walls to ignite buildings. Pots filled with quicklime were lobbed to blind and choke defenders. Sometimes, even captured messengers or unfortunate prisoners were used as gruesome projectiles, their bodies sent tumbling through the air as a horrifying message. More bizarrely, beehives or hornet nests were occasionally launched to unleash stinging chaos. One legendary, and particularly enormous, trebuchet was Warwolf or Loup de Guerre, built by King Edward I of England during the Siege of Stirling Castle in Scotland in 1304. Warwolf was reportedly so massive in its reputation, so fearsome that the Scottish garrison attempted to surrender before it was even fully assembled and fired. Edward, eager to test his new super weapon, reputedly refused to accept their surrender until he had seen Warwolf in action. It then proceeded to demolish a section of the castle wall with its first few shots, but for all its destructive glory, the trebuchet wasn't a fast-firing weapon. It took considerable time and effort, sometimes hours, to construct one on site. Reloading was a slow, laborious process, often taking many minutes, requiring a large crew to winch down the arm and prepare the next shot, and it demanded skilled engineers to design, build, aim, and maintain. Still, no other pre-gunpowder siege weapon combined such devastating range, overwhelming force, and profound psychological horror quite like the counterweight trebuchet. It was the medieval equivalent of a slow-motion hammer blow delivered from the heavens. And when that massive counterweight was released and began its inexorable drop, everyone within the besieged city held their breath, knowing that of destruction were about to rain down upon them, host from the desperate, solitary existence of the medieval assassin to the regal fury of Olympias, the mother who shaped an emperor. From the bewildering beauty of Knossos, a palace that became a myth, to the earth-shattering power of ancient siege engines, we've traversed a vast expanse of human history tonight. Each of these stories, in its own way, reveals the complexities, the brutalities, and the sheer, unyielding ingenuity of the human spirit. Whether driven by desperation, ambition, faith, or the grim necessities of war, The people of the past have left behind legacies that continue to fascinate, horrify, and inspire us. The shadows of the assassin remind us of the harsh realities, often glossed over in romantic tales. The life of Olympias shows us that power, especially for women in ancient times, was a dangerous game played with the highest stakes. The ruins of Knossos whisper of a civilization that valued beauty and mystery, leaving us with more questions than answers. And the ingenuity behind siege engines demonstrates a relentless drive to overcome any obstacle, to reshape the very landscape of conflict. These are not just stories. They are echoes of lives lived, empires built and broken, and mysteries that still beckon us from across the centuries. Thank you for joining me on this extended journey tonight. It's been a long exploration, and I appreciate you sticking with it. If you enjoyed this deep dive, do consider supporting the channel. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and remember that history is all around us, waiting to be uncovered. Good night.